I had always imagined that the first year of marriage would be full of love, laughter, and adventure. My husband John and I were excited to begin this journey together. Little did we know that our adventure would take us to a place shrouded in mystery and darkness, a house with a history that had the townsfolk filled with fear. The house stood at the end of Willow Street, an imposing Victorian structure that loomed over the neighborhood. The moment we laid eyes on it, we fell in love. The high, arched windows, the ornate wooden details, and the sprawling garden in the back. Everything about the house was perfect. We were told that it had been empty for years, but no one seemed eager to share the reason. As we moved in, I couldn't help but feel a sense of trepidation. The house had an air of antiquity, with creaking floorboards and long, dark hallways. The previous owner had left behind old, dusty furniture that seemed to belong to another era. The entire place was a throwback to the 19th century. We spent our first few days unpacking and exploring our new home. The living room was adorned with a grand fireplace, and a beautiful chandelier hung from the ceiling. It was the perfect place for cozy evenings together. The kitchen, though outdated, had a charming feel, and I couldn't wait to cook our first meal there. The bedroom, with its heavy drapes and old-fashioned wardrobe, was both enchanting and slightly eerie. It wasn't long before strange occurrences began. At first, it was the soft whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls. John and I exchanged nervous glances as we tried to make out the words. The whispers were unintelligible, but they sounded like voices from another time. One evening, as we sat in the living room, we heard the whispers again. This time, I was certain that the voice said, "Help me." I shivered and looked at John, who had a concerned expression. He dismissed it as a draft or our imagination, but the unease lingered. As the weeks went by, the whispers grew more frequent. I decided to confide in our neighbor, Mrs. Davis, who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. She was known as the local historian and a keeper of town secrets. Mrs. Davis listened to my story with a knowing look. "That house, dear," she began. "It has a history and not a pleasant one. It was built by a wealthy family in the late 1800s, the Chattertons. They were reclusive, strange people, and the townsfolk had always whispered about their dark practices." She paused for effect. "The Chattertons dabbled in the occult, trying to communicate with the dead. They believed the house had a connection to the spirit world, and they performed rituals in the hopes of unlocking its secrets." My heart raced as I realized that the whispers we heard might be connected to the Chattertons' experiments. Mrs. Davis went on, "It said that they summoned a presence they couldn't control, and it cursed the house. After that, no one dared to live there, and the Chatterton family vanished without a trace." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The house we had so eagerly moved into had a dark and chilling history. But what could we do? We had just started our life together, and leaving wasn't an option. We decided to research the house's history and learn more about the Chatterton family. Our research led us to old newspaper clippings and journal entries from the late 1800s. The more we discovered, the more we realized the depth of the Chatterton family's obsession with the supernatural. They believed that the house was a portal to the afterlife and that they could communicate with the dead through seances and dark rituals. One journal in particular made my pulse rise. The whispers grow louder, and I fear we have awakened something dark. Shadows move through the house at night, and I've seen apparitions in the hallways. We must find a way to undo what we've done before it's too late. It was evident that the Chattertons had unleashed something beyond their control, and it had plagued the house ever since. As we delved deeper into the history, we couldn't ignore the increasing occurrences in the house. Doors would open and close on their own, and we heard footsteps in empty rooms. The whispers continued, and I couldn't help but feel that they were trying to tell us something. One night we awoke to the sound of a child crying. John rushed out of bed and followed the sound to the nursery. There he saw a faint, ghostly figure, a little girl in a white dress. She turned to him with tearful eyes, her voice trembling as she said, "Help me, please." As he reached out to touch her, she disappeared into thin air. John returned to our room, his face pale. "I saw her," he said, his voice shaking. "A little girl, just like the one from the old photographs we found in the attic. She was asking for help." We couldn't ignore the plea of the ghostly child any longer. We reached out to Mrs. Davis once more, hoping she could shed light on the mysterious girl. She listened intently and revealed that the Chattertons had a daughter, Emily, who had gone missing and was never found. It was believed that the entity they had summoned had taken her, and her spirit was trapped in the house. We realized that Emily's spirit was trying to communicate with us, asking for the help she never received in life. We couldn't turn our backs on her, and we decided to try and find a way to release her from the house's curse. Mrs. Davis suggested that we perform a ritual to free Emily's spirit. She explained that it would be a way to break the connection between the Chatterton's experiments and the trapped souls. We were hesitant but desperate to bring peace to the house. With Mrs. Davis's guidance, we gathered the necessary materials and prepared for the ritual. The air grew heavy as we lit candles, burned sage, and chanted incantations. The whispers in the walls grew louder and more frantic, as if the spirits were aware of our intentions. In the midst of the ritual, a chill filled the room and a shadowy figure appeared before us. It was Emily, her eyes filled with both fear and longing. She whispered, "Thank you," before slowly fading away, leaving behind an overwhelming sense of relief. As the ritual concluded, the house fell silent. The whispers were gone and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. It was as though the curse that had plagued the house for decades had finally been broken. We felt a sense of peace we had never experienced before. In the weeks that followed, the house no longer felt haunted. It was a place of warmth, and we could finally enjoy our marriage without the constant presence of restless spirits. Emily had found her release, and the darkness that had clung to the house had dissipated. Story 2. My name is Alex Holloway, and I never believed in ghosts until I moved into Hollywood House. I had inherited the old Victorian mansion from a distant relative I'd never met. The news of my sudden inheritance came as a shock, but the prospect of living in such a grand, historic house excited me. Little did I know that the house came with a history that would test the very limits of my skepticism. I had always considered myself a rational, level-headed person. I was an engineer by profession, and I approached life with a practical and analytical mindset. Ghost stories were nothing more than tales told around campfires designed to scare and amuse. But that was before I set foot in Hollywood House. The mansion sat atop a hill overlooking the sleepy town of Hollywood. The exterior was a sight to behold, with its ornate architecture, towering turrets, and sprawling gardens. It was a place that seemed to belong to a different era, and the townsfolk whispered about its dark past. The house had stood empty for as long as anyone could remember, and its imposing presence cast a shadow over the town. My first night in Hollywood House was a surreal experience. As I walked through the echoing hallways with a single flickering candle, I couldn't help but wonder about the stories I'd heard. People claimed to have seen figures in the windows at night, heard unexplained footsteps in the empty corridors, and witnessed lights flicker and doors open and close on their own. These were the tales that had earned the mansion its haunted reputation. I settled into one of the spacious bedrooms on the second floor, the large canopy bed and heavy drapes making me feel like I'd stepped into a period drama. As I lay in bed, I tried to dismiss the unease I felt. The wind whistled through the old windows, and the house seemed to sigh with its own ancient history. That night, as I drifted off to sleep, I heard it, a faint, distant whisper. I dismissed it as a trick of the wind or my own overactive imagination. But the whisper persisted, growing louder and more distinct. It was as though a voice from the past was trying to communicate with me. I strained my ears, and the words became clearer. "Help me," the voice pleaded, soft and trembling. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, my breaths coming quick and shallow. The voice sounded desperate, like a soul in torment. I leaped out of bed and searched the room, but there was no one to be found. The windows were shut tight and the doors were locked. I had heard the voice, there was no doubt about it, but its source remained a mystery. In the following days, I tried to put the incident out of my mind, convincing myself that it had been a vivid dream. I was determined not to let such irrational thoughts take hold of me. I delved into my work, focusing on renovations to make the house livable. However, the feeling of being watched and the whispers persisted. It was as though the house itself was trying to communicate with me, to tell me something I couldn't yet comprehend. One evening, as I was exploring the dusty attic, I came across a trove of old letters and journals. They were written by the previous inhabitants of Hollywood House, the Eldridges, who had lived there in the late 19th century. The journals were filled with accounts of strange occurrences that mirrored my own experiences. One of them caught my eye. The house is not what it seems. It harbors a presence that defies explanation. We hear the whispers at night, voices from another world, and the shadows move with a purpose we cannot comprehend. The house is cursed, and it hungers for something we cannot fathom. The journals were filled with similar stories, of doors that opened on their own, of apparitions in the hallways, and of voices that pleaded for help. The Eldridges had lived in constant fear, and they eventually abandoned the house, leaving it to decay. I couldn't ignore the striking similarities between their experiences and my own. The house was not just haunted, it was cursed, as if an insatiable darkness clung to its very foundations. As I continued my research, I learned that the house had been built on the site of a tragic event, a fire that had claimed the lives of several townspeople. It was said that the souls of those who had perished in the fire were never at rest, and their restless spirits haunted the mansion. My skepticism wavered as the evidence piled up. The history of Hollywood House was filled with inexplicable events and unexplained phenomena. It was clear that the house held secrets that defied logic and reason. One night, as I sat in the library, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to surround me, as if the walls themselves were trying to communicate. I strained to listen, and the voice became distinct, a woman's voice filled with anguish. "Help me," she implored, her words resonating with sorrow. I followed the voice to the grand staircase, where a shadowy figure materialized before me. It was a woman, her eyes filled with despair. She was dressed in a gown from a bygone era, and her form flickered in and out of existence. "My name is Eleanor," she said, her voice trembling. "I died in the fire, and my spirit has been trapped here ever since. You are our only hope." Eleanor's story was one of tragedy. She had been a resident of Hollywood, a young woman with dreams and aspirations, until the fateful night of the fire. She had perished along with others, and their spirits had been bound to the house, unable to find peace. I couldn't turn my back on Eleanor's plea for help. I reached out to a local historian, Mr. Thompson, who had spent years researching the history of Hollywood House. He explained that the house was a focal point for paranormal activity, a place where the veil between the living and the dead was thin. With Mr. Thompson's guidance, we decided to conduct a ritual to free the trapped souls and cleanse the house of its dark history. We gathered in the living room, surrounded by candles and incense, and recited incantations passed down through generations. As we chanted, the atmosphere grew heavy, and the air seemed to vibrate with energy. The whispers in the walls intensified, as if the spirits were aware of our intentions. I felt a presence in the room, a gathering of souls seeking release. Suddenly, the room grew icy cold, and the shadowy figures of the trapped souls materialized before us. Eleanor, along with others, stood in a solemn assembly, their eyes filled with gratitude and longing. The atmosphere was charged with emotion as we completed the ritual. The spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the ether. Eleanor's voice, filled with relief, echoed through the room. "Thank you," she whispered, and then she was gone. The house fell silent, and the weight of its cursed history seemed to lift. The whispers were gone, and the oppressive atmosphere had dissipated. I had not only inherited a haunted house, but had played a part in setting its restless souls free. In the weeks that followed, Hollywood House no longer felt haunted. It was a place of serenity, with no whispers or unexplained phenomena. The history of the mansion had changed from one of darkness to one of redemption. As I continued my life in Hollywood, I couldn't help but reflect on the mysteries of the house. I had learned that sometimes the unexplainable defied the rational mind. The spirits that had haunted the house were not malevolent, but trapped souls seeking release from their torment. I had been a part of their liberation, and the experience had forever altered my perception of the supernatural. Hollywood House, once a place of fear and uncertainty, had become a sanctuary of peace and redemption. Its history no longer whispered of despair, but of the resilience of the human spirit and the power of compassion and understanding. And as I looked out at the town of Hollywood from the mansion's grand windows, I knew that the house had found its own peace, and so had I. And as I looked out at the town of Hollywood from the mansion's grand windows, I knew that the house had found its own peace, and so had I. Story 3. Alex and Jess had purchased their dream home, an old charming cottage nestled in a picturesque countryside. The house had a unique character with its exposed wooden beams, stone fireplace, and a sense of history that seemed to seep through its walls. They believed it was the perfect place to start their life together. As they settled into their new home, they couldn't help but feel a sense of wonder and excitement. The cottage held so much potential, and they looked forward to making it their own. But their journey of discovery would soon take an eerie turn. One sunny afternoon, while Alex was inspecting the basement for any needed repairs, he noticed an unusual gap in the stone wall that seemed out of place. Curiosity piqued, he investigated further and discovered a hidden door. It was concealed behind a stack of old crates and almost impossible to spot. Alex and Jess worked together to pry the door open, revealing a narrow, dusty corridor that led to a small, forgotten room. The room was filled with cobwebs, and the air was heavy with the scent of age. But what captured their attention most was an old, leather-bound diary sitting on a dusty wooden table in the center of the room. The diary was dated from the early 1900s and belonged to a woman named Eleanor. As they began to read, they became engrossed in the life of the previous occupant. Eleanor had lived in the cottage with her husband, Arthur, and their young daughter, Emily. Eleanor's entries chronicled the family's life, but as they read further, they encountered disturbing details. Eleanor wrote of a mysterious presence in the house, one that seemed to manifest in the form of eerie whispers, inexplicable drafts of cold air, and objects moving on their own. The entries grew more frantic as Eleanor described sleepless nights and a growing sense of dread. She mentioned hearing voices that urged her to leave the cottage, warning her that something malevolent resided within its walls. But she and Arthur were determined to keep their home and protect their daughter. As Alex and Jess continued to read, they noticed a pattern in Eleanor's entries, the mention of a secret room hidden in the basement. Eleanor believed that whatever haunted their home was tied to that hidden space. She wrote of her plans to uncover its mysteries, but the diary abruptly stopped. Alex and Jess were both intrigued and unnerved by the diary's contents. They decided to investigate the hidden room mentioned by Eleanor, feeling compelled to uncover the truth about the haunting. With flashlights in hand, they descended into the basement and followed the narrow corridor to the secret room. It was locked, and after some effort, they managed to pry it open. The room was small and dimly lit, with stone walls covered in strange symbols and a feeling of oppressive energy that sent shivers down their spines. On a rickety wooden shelf, they discovered a series of old journals that had belonged to Arthur. As they skimmed through the entries, a chilling narrative began to emerge. Arthur had continued where Eleanor left off, documenting his own experiences with the malevolent force that haunted the house. He wrote of being tormented by vivid nightmares, of feeling a cold, clammy hand brushing against him in the dead of night, and of witnessing objects levitating and crashing to the ground. The journals contained pleas for help and prayers for deliverance. As Alex and Jess read on, they realized that Arthur had become obsessed with uncovering the source of the haunting, the secret room. He believed that the key to freeing their family from the malevolent entity lay within its hidden walls. With trembling hands, they turned their attention to the room itself. They searched for any hidden compartments or clues that might lead them to the truth. It was then that Alex noticed a loose stone in the wall, and when he pushed it aside, they revealed a small concealed chamber. Inside, they found a wooden chest covered in dust and cobwebs. With bated breath, they opened it, revealing a collection of old photographs, letters, and a small weathered doll that sent a chill down their spines. The doll bore a striking resemblance to Emily, the daughter mentioned in Eleanor's diary. As they examined the contents of the chest, they realized that it held the remnants of a tragic family history, a history that had somehow become intertwined with the malevolent presence in the house. Determined to uncover the truth and put an end to the haunting, Alex and Jess continued their research. They reached out to a local historian who delved into the history of the cottage and its previous occupants. What they discovered was a heartbreaking tale of a family torn apart by tragedy. Eleanor and Arthur had indeed lived in the cottage with their young daughter, Emily. But Emily had mysteriously disappeared one fateful night, never to be found again. The heartbreak of losing their child had shattered the family, and the malevolent presence that had haunted the house was believed to be the spirit of Emily, trapped in a state of torment and confusion. With this knowledge in hand, Alex and Jess decided to hold a seance in the hidden room, hoping to communicate with the spirit of Emily and offer her the peace and closure she so desperately needed. As they gathered in the dimly lit room, surrounded by the symbols on the walls, they reached out to Emily's spirit. Through the seance, they managed to establish a connection with her, and the room filled with a palpable sense of sorrow and longing. Emily's spirit conveyed her confusion and fear, revealing that she had been trying to reach out to her parents for years, but her efforts had only fueled their terror. She longed for her family's forgiveness, and for a way to move on from the torment that bound her to the house. With tears in their eyes, Alex and Jess assured Emily that they understood her pain and were willing to help. They performed a ritual to guide her spirit towards the light, offering words of forgiveness and love. As they completed the ritual, the room seemed to brighten and a sense of peace washed over them. They knew that Emily's spirit had finally found the release it had yearned for. In the days that followed, the cottage felt different. The oppressive presence had vanished, replaced by a sense of serenity and warmth. Alex and Jess knew that they had played a crucial role in bringing closure to a long-forgotten tragedy. They decided to preserve the hidden room as a place of remembrance for Emily, a testament to her enduring spirit. The cottage, once haunted by a painful history, had now become a place of healing and redemption. Story 4. David, a talented musician, had always dreamt of having his private recording studio. When he stumbled upon an old mansion in a quiet countryside, he saw the perfect opportunity to turn his dream into reality. The mansion was a grand and imposing structure with high vaulted ceilings and ornate architecture, a perfect setting for his creative endeavors. As David began setting up his recording equipment in the mansion's grand living room, he couldn't help but marvel at the acoustics and the rich, warm sound that filled the space. It was as if the very walls of the house resonated with music. Late one night, as David was tinkering with his instruments and recording software, he heard the faint strains of a piano melody. At first, he dismissed it as a product of his tired imagination, but the music persisted, growing clearer and more enchanting with each passing moment. Following the haunting melody, David found himself drawn to a locked room on the second floor. It was a room he had never noticed before, and the door was adorned with intricate carvings of musical notes and instruments. The room seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. Determined to uncover the source of the haunting music, David searched the mansion for a key. After a thorough investigation, he discovered an old brass key tucked away in a dusty drawer. With trepidation and excitement, he inserted the key into the door's lock, and it creaked open to reveal a room frozen in time. The room was a magnificent music chamber, with a grand piano at its center. The walls were adorned with portraits of composers long past, and sheet music was scattered across the polished wooden floor. It was as if the room had been untouched for centuries. As David approached the grand piano, he noticed a journal resting on its dusty surface. The journal belonged to a composer named Victor, and it detailed his obsession with a symphony he had never been able to finish. A symphony that was meant to be his masterpiece. Victor's entries spoke of a mysterious muse who had inspired him with hauntingly beautiful melodies. He described the muse as a ghostly presence that would visit him in the dead of night, whispering enchanting compositions into his ear. As David read on, he realized that Victor had been consumed by his desire to complete the symphony. He had isolated himself from the world, pouring all his creative energy into the haunting melodies that had been gifted to him by the enigmatic muse. But Victor's obsession had taken a toll on his sanity. He wrote of sleepless nights, of hearing the muse's voice even during waking hours, and of a growing darkness that seemed to overshadow his life. David felt a deep connection to Victor's story, as if he understood the composer's yearning for creative perfection. He decided to honor Victor's memory and complete the unfinished symphony, believing that it was his destiny to bring the haunting music to life. With each passing day, David dedicated himself to the symphony, spending hours at the grand piano, composing and refining the melodies that had been left incomplete for so long. The music seemed to flow effortlessly, as if guided by an unseen hand. But as David delved deeper into the symphony, he began to experience strange occurrences. He would hear whispers in the empty rooms, voices that seemed to echo the haunting melodies he was composing. Shadows danced in his peripheral vision, and he often felt a chilling presence watching over him. One night, as he sat alone in the music chamber, absorbed in the composition, he felt a cold, ethereal hand gently touch his shoulder. Startled, he turned to see a ghostly figure. A woman dressed in a flowing gown, her eyes filled with a mixture of longing and sorrow. The figure extended her hand toward David, and without hesitation he reached out and touched it. As their hands met, he felt a surge of emotions, loss, passion, and an unfulfilled yearning for completion. Through the connection, David understood that the ghostly woman was the muse who had inspired Victor. She had longed for her symphony to be brought to life, to be heard by the world, and to find closure for her own unfinished story. Determined to honor the muse's wishes, David continued his work on the symphony, pouring his heart and soul into the haunting melodies. As he composed the final notes, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment, as if he had completed a journey that had spanned centuries. The night he performed the finished symphony in the grand living room of the mansion, a sense of transcendence filled the air. The music flowed through the space, carrying with it the emotions and yearnings of the muse. It was a symphony that spoke of love, loss, and the eternal quest for artistic perfection. As the last note faded into silence, David felt a gentle breeze caress his cheek, and he knew that the muse had finally found peace. The mansion, once haunted by the specter of creative obsession, now resonated with a sense of artistic fulfillment. David continued to use the mansion as his recording studio, but he always left the music chamber untouched, as a testament to the creative journey he had embarked on, and the connection he had forged with the haunting muse. Story 5. The day we moved into Sterling House was like any other. The sun cast long shadows on the lawn as we carried our boxes through the creaking front door. My husband David and I had always dreamed of owning an old Victorian house, and Sterling House was the embodiment of that dream. It was a stately 3-story structure with a wraparound porch, intricate woodwork, and a history that whispered through its weathered walls. Our 2 children, Emily and Daniel, were thrilled at the idea of living in such a grand house, though there was one peculiar aspect that gave them pause. The townsfolk had whispered about the house, calling it haunted and cursed. They claimed it was a place of restless spirits and unexplained events. But we dismissed these stories as mere superstition, eager to start our new life. The first night in Sterling House was quiet and uneventful. We gathered in the cozy, old-fashioned living room to celebrate our new beginning. The fireplace crackled with life, and Emily and Daniel played with their toys. The only thing that seemed odd was the faint odor of roses that lingered in the air, but we attributed it to some old potpourri left behind by the previous owners. That night, as we settled into our respective rooms, I couldn't help but marvel at the house's character. The rooms were spacious, and the moonlight filtered through the lace curtains, casting intricate patterns on the hardwood floors. I fell asleep to the soothing sound of the wind rustling through the leaves outside. But then, in the dead of night, I was jolted awake by a soft, distant whisper. It was so faint that I couldn't make out the words. I lay in bed, straining my ears, but the voice disappeared as quickly as it had come. I shook off the cold feeling, blaming it on my imagination running wild. Over the next few weeks, strange things began to happen. Emily started having vivid nightmares, waking up in tears, speaking of a dark figure at the foot of her bed. Daniel claimed he saw his toys move on their own and heard whispers in the hallways. I too experienced the whispered voices at odd hours, and the scent of roses became more pronounced. David, ever the skeptic, brushed off our concerns, attributing it to stress and our overactive imaginations. He urged us to embrace the house's charm and history, rather than fear its supposed hauntings. One day, while I was cleaning out the attic, I came across a stack of old, dusty journals. They were filled with the handwritten thoughts and experiences of previous residents. The entries were a mix of mundane daily life and accounts of strange occurrences that mirrored our own. One sentence from the year 1923 stood out. "The whispers persist, and I can't bear to sleep in the master bedroom anymore. The scent of roses lingers, and I often feel a cold presence by my side. I know not what haunts this house, but I am certain it is not of this world." The journal was filled with similar stories, and it sent a cold breeze down my back. I shared my discovery with David, who, despite his skepticism, couldn't deny the scary connection between our experiences and those of the previous residents. As our unease grew, we decided to investigate the house's history. We discovered that a family named the Sterlings had lived in the house for generations until it was sold to the family we had purchased it from. The Sterlings had been prominent in the town, known for their wealth and power. Rumor had it that the family had a dark side, dabbling in the occult and dark practices. Determined to put an end to the unsettling occurrences, we decided to contact a local historian to learn more about the Sterling family's past. The historian, Mrs. Anderson, was a frail, elderly woman with a wealth of knowledge about the town's history. She invited us to her home to share her findings. Mrs. Anderson's living room was filled with ancient books and dusty tomes. She began to recount the history of the Sterlings, explaining that they had been obsessed with the occult and the afterlife. They were rumored to have performed dark rituals within the house, and it was said that they had communed with the dead. The Sterlings were searching for something beyond the realm of the living, Mrs. Anderson said. They believed that the house held a gateway to another world, and their experiments were their attempt to bridge the gap between life and death. As she spoke, I couldn't help but wonder if the strange occurrences we'd experienced were somehow linked to the Sterling family's obsession with the supernatural. Mrs. Anderson offered to help us cleanse the house and rid it of any lingering negative energy. She explained that we needed to perform a ritual that would break the connection between our world and the other side. That night we gathered in the living room, the hearth crackling with a warm fire. Mrs. Anderson led the ritual, guiding us through each step. We lit candles, burned sage, and recited incantations to banish any lingering spirits. As we chanted, the air grew heavy and the scent of roses became overpowering. A soft wind rustled through the curtains. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped and a shadowy figure materialized before us. It was a woman, her eyes hollow and sorrowful. She seemed to be from another time, dressed in a gown reminiscent of the early 1900s. Her presence made my blood freeze. The figure spoke in a soft, mournful voice. "You have awakened me from my slumber. I am Isabella Sterling, and I have been trapped in this house for eternity. The experiments of my family tethered me to this realm, and I have longed for release." Tears welled up in her eyes as she told us her story. Isabella explained that she had been an innocent victim of her family's dark pursuits. They had used her as a vessel to communicate with the dead, and her spirit had been bound to the house ever since. We felt a deep sympathy for Isabella, trapped in a liminal state between life and death. Mrs. Anderson continued the ritual, beseeching Isabella to find peace and move on to the afterlife. Isabella's form began to waver, and her voice faded as she gradually disappeared into the ether. The room grew still and the scent of roses lifted. It was as though the weight of centuries had been lifted from Sterling House. We completed the ritual, ensuring that Isabella's spirit had found the release it had longed for. In the days that followed, the house felt different. The air was lighter, and the unsettling occurrences ceased. Emily and Daniel's nightmares subsided, and the whispers that had haunted us for weeks disappeared. It was as if the house had been cleansed of its dark past. Sterling House, once a place of fear and uncertainty, had become a warm and welcoming home. Isabella's presence no longer lingered, and the history that had whispered through its walls was now a distant echo. We had finally found peace in our new home. As the years passed, we cherished our time in Sterling House. It had become a place of happiness. Story 6. Sarah and Mark had always dreamed of owning a charming old house with character. So, when they stumbled upon a dilapidated Victorian mansion tucked away on a quiet street, they couldn't believe their luck. The place was a mess, but they saw its potential. With determination, they began the renovations. The first few weeks went smoothly as they painted walls, replaced floorboards, and restored the grand staircase. But then, strange things started happening. One evening, Sarah left her paintbrush on the kitchen counter while she went to fetch a glass of water. When she returned, the brush was on the floor and the faucet was running. She assumed it was Mark playing a prank, but he denied it. As days turned into weeks, the occurrences became more unsettling. Tools would vanish only to reappear in odd places. Eerie whispers echoed through the empty hallways at night, and both Sarah and Mark felt a constant chill in the air, no matter how high they turned up the heating. One evening, as they relaxed in the living room after a long day's work, they heard the creaking of footsteps on the stairs above. Their hearts pounded as they looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. Mark grabbed a flashlight and they crept up the staircase, their footsteps echoing through the hollow house. The upper floor was dark, save for the occasional flicker of a candle-like glow that seemed to be moving ahead of them. Following the eerie light, they found themselves in a dusty, neglected room. There, in the corner, stood an old trunk. As Mark opened it, they found a series of handwritten letters tied with a faded ribbon. The letters were dated from the early 1900s and were addressed to a woman named Margaret. The letters spoke of a forbidden love affair between Margaret and a man named Samuel. Margaret's husband, it seemed, had discovered their secret, leading to a terrible tragedy. The final letter hinted at a curse placed upon the house, a curse that would torment anyone who dared to live within its walls. Sarah and Mark were horrified by what they had uncovered. They couldn't believe they had stumbled upon such a dark secret hidden within their dream home. But they couldn't deny the escalating paranormal activity that had plagued them since they began the renovations. Fearing for their safety, they decided to leave the house, but the malevolent presence wasn't ready to let them go. As they packed their belongings, a sudden gust of icy wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles and plunging them into darkness. Terrified, they stumbled toward the door, but it slammed shut before they could escape. The room seemed to come alive, with furniture floating in the air and ghostly figures appearing all around them. Desperate and overwhelmed, they clung to each other, reciting prayers and begging for release from the vengeful spirits. Finally, as the clock struck midnight, the apparitions vanished, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Sarah and Mark fled the house, never looking back. They left behind their dream home, realizing that some dreams are better left unfulfilled, especially when they come with a curse. As they stood outside in the cold night air, the full moon casting an eerie glow on the old Victorian mansion. Story 7. When Emma inherited her grandmother's Victorian mansion, she saw it as an opportunity for a fresh start. The house stood nestled among ancient oaks, its exterior adorned with intricate gingerbread trim. Memories of childhood visits filled her with nostalgia, and she couldn't wait to restore the place to its former glory. As she explored the house, memories of her grandmother flooded back. Warm evenings in the garden, the comforting scent of her famous apple pie, and the soothing lullabies that used to fill the air. Yet beneath these cherished memories, Emma couldn't help but remember the stories her grandmother had whispered to her as a child, the stories of a haunting that had plagued the family for generations. One evening, as Emma was sifting through her grandmother's old belongings in the attic, she stumbled upon a stack of dusty journals. These journals, she soon realized, were her grandmother's personal diaries, filled with tales of strange occurrences and her growing fear of the house. The entries described chilling encounters with unseen entities, mysterious shadows that roamed the hallways at night, and whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Emma's grandmother wrote of a sense of being watched, of a malevolent presence that seemed to feed off her fear. As Emma delved deeper into the journals, she discovered that her grandmother had sought the help of mediums, psychics, and even priests to rid the house of the malevolent force. But all attempts had been in vain, and her grandmother's descent into madness was palpable in the later entries. Haunted by her grandmother's words, Emma decided to investigate further. She contacted a paranormal researcher named Dr. Richard Thornton, who specialized in cases involving haunted properties. Dr. Thornton agreed to visit the mansion and conduct a thorough investigation. On a stormy night with rain pounding against the windows and thunder rumbling in the distance, Dr. Thornton arrived at the mansion. Emma greeted him at the door, her anxiety evident. Together, They ventured into the heart of the house, armed with cameras, voice recorders, and a sense of trepidation. As they began their investigation, strange occurrences manifested themselves. Doors creaked open on their own, and cold spots seemed to materialize out of thin air. Dr. Thornton's equipment detected fluctuations in electromagnetic fields, and eerie EVPs, electronic voice phenomena, whispered chilling messages. In the attic, where Emma had discovered her grandmother's journals, the activity reached its peak. The air grew heavy with a palpable sense of dread, and the temperature dropped dramatically. Emma felt a presence close by, as if someone, or something, was watching her every move. Dr. Thornton conducted a series of seances and communicated with the entities using a spirit board. Through these interactions, they learned that the malevolent force had a name: Elijah. Elijah claimed to be a tortured soul who had died tragically in the house long ago and had been bound to it ever since. Emma, filled with empathy, tried to understand Elijah's pain and the reason behind his malevolence. As the hours passed, she and Dr. Thornton unraveled the tragic tale of a love affair gone awry, one that had led to Elijah's untimely death and his eternal torment. It became apparent that Elijah sought release from the curse that bound him to the house. With Dr. Thornton's guidance, Emma decided to help. They performed a ritual to communicate with Elijah's spirit and guide him towards the light. It was a fraught and emotional process, filled with fear and uncertainty. As the ritual reached its climax, a blinding light enveloped the attic and a sense of profound peace washed over them. Emma could feel Elijah's presence receding, and she knew that he had finally found the release he had longed for. With the curse lifted, the house felt different, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from its foundations. The paranormal activity ceased, and Emma could finally breathe a sigh of relief. She decided to continue her grandmother's legacy by turning the mansion into a small bed and breakfast, sharing the history of the house and its spirits with those who dared to stay. Emma knew that her grandmother's tragic story was finally at an end, and she had played a part in bringing peace to the restless spirits that had haunted the old Victorian mansion for generations.